Nebraska, were they cowardly or smart for canceling the home and home series with the Vols? Because it's left Tennessee in an incredible pickle. We'll talk about this a little bit later, or maybe we'll just talk about it now. Tennessee doesn't have a Power 4 opponent that they can schedule. They've already scoured the nation and try to find a home and home. Now, the SEC does require that you have a Power 4 opponent, which would be ACC, Big 10, Big 12, and the SEC. That's probably not going to happen. So here are the options, as heard from Daddy White. And when you talk about the options, none of them are very good, to be real frank with you. You have an option of you can play a home and home with a non-Power 4 team, non-Power 4 program, and that would require an exemption from the SEC. Then on the other side of that, you have playing a neutral site game, which has all the excitement of, I don't know, a wet blanket. So, Caleb, let's start with Nebraska. Were they cowardly or smart for canceling that series? And when you get a chance, we'll go ahead and make that the poll question.
I think they were smart, and I'm going to break down exactly what happened. So this comes down to two reports, and I'm going to quote them both. Pete Thamel reported on ESPN just yesterday that he thinks it comes down to Nebraska just didn't want to play the series. Now, remember, guys, the pretext Nebraska gave was they wanted 8 home games the year that they were set to visit Tennessee because their stadium renovations that year, so they were going to have fewer seats. But Pete Thamel just straight up said, no, they didn't want to play the series. And he said the one piece of empirical evidence is the 12-team playoff indicates murky rewards for a tough non-conference schedule. And Pete Thamel brought up Indiana last year, which played a horrible non-conference schedule in the Big Ten, and then played the worst Big Ten schedule and was rewarded for it for getting into the playoff. So then Matt Rhule, Nebraska's head coach, came out recently and all but admitted that they didn't want to play that game. His exact quote about playing major non-conference games was, quote, "Why would you ever play one of those games? If we're being completely honest, I'm at a point in life where in my 4th job and after getting fired in the NFL, I kind of say what I feel nowadays and I could care less. Why in the world would a Big Ten team who's already playing 9 conference games, why would you ever play one of these games? You look at a lot of teams, and this is not anti-SEC, but there's some SEC teams last year that only played 3 away games in another team's stadium. 3. We're in a league where some years you have 5 Big Ten home games, some years you have 5 on the road. You have to go on the road 5 times in the Big Ten with no like Florida, Georgia, and a neutral site. And he goes further. He says the College Football Playoff Committee, they proved to us this year when they did the seeding and all this stuff that early season wins didn't mean a thing. That really was, at the end of the day, what you looked like in the last month of the season. That's what it all proved to us. And when I say what it looks like, it's really good how your offense, it's really how good your offense is. If you're scoring points and blowing people out late in the year, you're going to make the playoffs. We beat Colorado. That was the same weekend that Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. That was a huge win for us. That was a huge loss for them. They made the playoff. Obviously, we did not. So I don't know why. I don't know what the incentive is unless the SEC and Big Ten get together at some point and say, we're doing this, we're doing that. Everything he's saying is absolutely right. There was no reward. There was no punishment for Indiana last year. And I'm just going to bring this up to you guys real quick. Indiana's schedule last year, in case you guys wondered, their non-conference schedule was Florida International, Western Illinois, and Charlotte, to complement playing 8 of the 9 worst 10 Big Ten games. If you're Nebraska, why in the world would you play a premier non-conference game at this point, given the format you just saw that Indiana got rewarded with?
Now, this is why the SEC needs to go to a 9-game schedule, so they take it out of the individual school's hands. And I'll side with you on Nebraska. They play a 9-game schedule. Those are theoretically non-tough games, although we could argue how tough the Big 12 is, but nevertheless.
Big 10, you mean?
Big 10, excuse me. We could argue how tough the Big 10 is. I think it's top-heavy, but I don't know that you're really playing 9 difficult games like you would in the SEC. But let's not get caught up on that. I want to flip it to Tennessee's side. Had Tennessee canceled this series, it would have been cowardly because they play an 8-game conference schedule. So I'll go with you on the Cornhuskers. I'll defend the Cornhuskers with you, but I'm curious what you think if this were Tennessee to have canceled the series like they did against Army. It's not the same, but they've canceled series before, and it's not a good look for the most part. But had they canceled the series, would have been a good move for Tennessee. I'd say absolutely not.
I still say good move for Tennessee for 2 reasons.
No way.
Wait, for 2 reasons. Now, the imbalanced conference schedules, I will say it doesn't really matter. But there's a bigger imbalance between in the Big Ten than the SEC. If you play the bottom half of the Big Ten schedule, Dave, there's no way to play an SEC schedule and not run into a few tough teams, right? Maybe 3 or 4.
Yeah, I think I'm going to oversimplify this. If you're playing an 8-game SEC schedule, you're playing 6 teams that you're either an underdog to or it's within 10 points. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Big Ten, for one of the premier programs like Ohio State, you're probably playing 3 teams like that. Is that fair?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Indiana can't get the draw. It's impossible to get the draw in the SEC that Indiana got in the Big Ten. That's not possible in the SEC. It can still be easy. Like Texas got about as easy of a draw as you could possibly get. It was still a much tougher schedule than Indiana's. So because of that, I think an 8-game schedule is more justified in the SEC than a 9-game in the Big Ten for the most part. And I just got to add, I'm sorry, again, I still think it's justified because of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. They didn't value anything at all when it came to strength of schedule. Literally, they threw it out the window. There's no scenario where, there is no scenario where they had certain rankings and teams belonged where they did. And with that in mind, I'm sorry, I got to say that I would not blame Tennessee if they nix it, even though it's 8 conference games. Because I think, look, I've said this. I think they should ditch the Syracuse game this year. They should be ditching every Power 5 game possible until the committee resets its formula.
Well, now theoretically they can't because the SEC requires you to play a Power 4 opponent. But what we're finding out with this Nebraska cancellation is Tennessee may not be able to uphold that requirement. And that's very likely going to be the case. So I kind of laughed out loud that Alex Golish said, how about a home and home with South Florida? That may very well happen. A non-Power 4 opponent. That could happen. Don't be surprised. What I think will end up happening is you'll have a neutral site game. And I'm so sick of the neutral site games. They're so antiseptic. They're just, they don't do anything for me. I understand the old argument of you want to be in Charlotte, you want to be in Atlanta to get a recruiting advantage. But Caleb, I think that's overblown nowadays. The world has shrunk with social media. And I think kids know everything they need to know about a school. They don't need to see them. And they might not even go to the game, for goodness sake. That being in Charlotte or being in Atlanta gives you a little bit of a recruiting advantage, but not anything that I would stroke a big check over.
Well, you're right. The promoters of those events need to stroke the big check. And I don't know if they're going to be able to do that anymore, particularly so let's go back to like 2017 when Alabama played Florida State or something like that. Chick-fil-A and the preseason, Mercedes-Benz Dome, they were going to open up the checkbook and give a lot of money for that game, right? Because there was major college football playoff implications. Are any promoters going to, hosting one of these neutral site games, are they ever going to pay top dollar for a game like that again when there's not that much of a college football playoff implication for it?
No, probably not.
So you might as well do a home and home at that point, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Home and home. Who are some Power 4 schools? Non-Power 4 schools, that you would like to see Tennessee take on? So, actually, let's just open it up to the first couple that are on our message board. That's who we're going to go with. So we'll shift a little bit. We'll discuss a couple of programs that Tennessee could bring in for a home and home. I want to go ahead and say South Florida is one of those because I don't think that's a bad idea whatsoever. And today's tough question brought to you by Banks & Jones, Tennessee's trial attorney, banksandjones.com.
Why Banks & Jones? Well, it's because they're Tennessee's trial attorney. You can play to win with Banks & Jones because they'll go to trial. You've heard of other lawyers. They say they'll go to trial and fight for you. They won't. They just want to settle. That's the easiest way out. Well, that's not Banks and Jones, led by T. Scott Jones. They won't settle. They'll go to trial for you. Tennessee's trial attorney. They play to win. Truly, Tennessee's trial attorney when it comes to criminal defense or personal injury. Why settle? It's Banks and Jones. T. Scott.
All right, so let's make it a poll question, and this is very unofficial, but I want to put South Florida up there as a home and home. And then we had someone on the message board. Let me go to that so I give them proper credit. Derek says, call Dion. You know, Dion's the type of guy that would make things happen. Now, according to Danny White on a recent appearance on WNML in Knoxville, there's not a Power 4 opponent that has, because you have to have the same week, not just an open date. So Colorado wouldn't be an option unless they move something around. The other one I would like to throw out there and is Memphis, because Memphis, perhaps, Caleb, and you can speak to this, being a Memphian, that could perhaps resurrect the basketball rivalry. Perhaps. I think that's a little bit of a reach, but I don't have a problem with there being a connection there. I feel like that's always been undervalued and underplayed. And I am not going to put Arkansas State on there. Unsung says, is making fun of my hair. He says I look like a hippie. Yeah, I need a haircut. Off topic, Dave. Will you grow a mullet for this upcoming football season? I will agree to do this. I will go ahead and go on record. Starting with preseason camp, I will grow a mullet until Tennessee loses a game. How about that?
I'm not a fan.
Well, it's probably going to be the Georgia game in September, so it wouldn't be the end of the world. Super chat, Timothy, read it, Caleb. It goes to Quincy Calhoun's college fund.
Tennessee is afraid they'd get beat up and beat by Army. Unfortunately, the last time they played an academy, a great player got hurt, Inky Johnson. Yeah, because they play the triple option. Let me throw in a couple of home and homes real quick, because you said Colorado and Memphis. I'm with Derek. Tulane. Going to New Orleans and back. I mean, like that's not a bad situation to go down to New Orleans.
Is that really going to be our fourth school? We've got 3 awesome schools, and we're going to throw Tulane in there?
You threw Memphis in there. No, we only have 3, Colorado, Memphis, and Tulane.
Right. So the 4 no. We've got South Florida.
Oh, that's right. South Florida.
I love it. I love the Dion thing. I think he'd shake things up and make it happen. I think he'd just call and say, we're going to do that.
All of these are recruiting moves.
Colorado is Power 4, Big 12. We've kind of opened it up a little bit just for coolness.
Yeah.
I believe Dion would make it happen.
I think he would too. They don't have to do one like some people would say Georgia Tech for Atlanta recruiting, but you already played Georgia. So like you can go to Atlanta anytime. You don't really have to play Georgia Tech. No, I'm going to go those 4. Yeah. And it's all recruiting based. South Florida, which it's not in South Florida and still always drives me crazy.
I know. And it's campus covered bowl practice there. It's weird. You're in Tampa.
Right. So yeah, South Florida, Colorado, Memphis, and Tulane. And the reason all those are relevant is because you can either get into a place for recruiting or the exposure of Colorado would help you. So yeah, my vote on those would probably be Colorado because of the Dion and the hype that would come with it.
Well, give me the 4th so we can fill out our poll question on
we
YouTube.
already got it.
Oh, who are the 4?
I gave you Tulane. I'm sticking with Tulane. Colorado, Memphis, Tulane, USF. I want to go to New Orleans.
You just took over. You just absolutely hijacked the poll question.
You named the first 3. I got to name 1.
Oh my goodness.
I took over the poll question. And Tulane is not a bad one. Dave, how many times have me and you both agreed Louisiana, like per capita, is probably the best state in the country with like raw NFL talent? Like just freakishly athletic people.
Okay, you're winning me over with Tulane a little bit.
Like, we've talked about this before. You can track this with the NFL. Like the most freakishly athletic war daddies are like in the South. We always talk about that. Wouldn't you agree it's on another level in Louisiana? Like there's the South versus the rest of the country, and then there's Louisiana versus the rest of the South. I mean, they're another level of freakishly athletic.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Caleb. If you did that, is it more from a recruiting perspective or a fan travel perspective?
Recruiting. You want to get into, I've been saying in the NIL age, LSU doesn't have a lock on that state anymore. You want to get into Louisiana. You want to get some of those kids.
See, I really think it's both. I think you've come up with a good one now that I give it a second thought because there's a lot of ties between Tennessee and the city of New Orleans with the Sugar Bowl in '85.
Mhm.
And I think there are a lot of people that would make that very easy trip to New Orleans. And you have the ancillary stuff going around Bourbon Street and all that. So I think it makes sense on a couple of different fronts. I would actually argue it makes more sense from a fan perspective because the fans are getting gypped out of being able to go to Nebraska and host Nebraska. And there are a lot of fans, Caleb. I know you look at it pragmatically, and I appreciate that. But you look at it pragmatically as what's the easiest way to get to the playoffs. There's still some fans that would like to throw the dice and see what happens against a Power Four opponent. So Tulane, how was Tulane last year? Were they any good? I don't know.
They have a decent program right now. Tulane is kind of like one of those where they're a good program for their level. Yeah, they were 9-5. They made it to the AAC title game. So they're not. I mean, that's not bad. And you got to remember, like a school like Tulane, it's kind of like I talk about with Louisiana recruiting. LSU gets their pick of the litter, but Dave, you know this as well as I do. If you're at one of those smaller schools in Louisiana, like Group of 5 programs, to compete on your level, don't you just need gas money to go get some high school guys?
Pretty much.